40-some years ago, I enlisted in the military, and I wanted to go to Vietnam and kill communists. I wasn't drafted. I wanted to do it. I didn't decide that on my own. Catholic Church, and which I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and the media were the ones that prepped me to enlist and go off. The highest cardinal in the United States, Cardinal Spellman, and the chief of chaplains would actually get on aircraft carriers and bless bombs before they were dropped on Vietnamese villages. I thought that was the right thing to do. The Catholic Church at that time didn't recognize conscientious objection. But even if it had, it wouldn't have made any difference with me. They had us read 3 books by a guy named Dr. Tom Dooley, who was a Maryknoll priest in Vietnam and Laos. And the books talked about how the communists would go into villages and they would put chopsticks in children's ears. And they would say, "You'll never hear the rosary again." And then they would take the priests and they would cut their tongues out and say, "You'll never teach the Our Father again." And again, that was 3 books in high school that I had read. I thought I knew what was going on there. And so that question of preparing me, both in society and with those things. When I got to Vietnam, I thought it was going to be half the people were going to be Catholic, and it ended up, of course, not even 10% were Catholic. The reality was a lot different from the books. When I went to enlist in the service, my family is Mexican-American, and I'm from California. And my father's first language was Spanish, and he had been a Second World War vet. He went overseas when he was 44. That's how much he believed in fighting Nazis. And he sat me on his lap. I was 18 and he was 66. And he bawled. He said, "I don't want you to go to Vietnam, and I don't want you to die." And I said, "But Dad, you and Harold," which is my brother who's 25 years older than me, both of them were Second World War vets. And I said, "You and Harold went off to fight. I'm only doing what our family has done for 100 years." And my dad said to me, "Son, your brother and I went off to fight people that were putting human beings in ovens. You're just going to be fighting some farmer who doesn't even want to be bothered with you." And my father, who I had never disobeyed in my life, before or after, crying and asking me not to go, but it wasn't enough, because I knew the church, and Walter Cronkite and Lyndon Johnson knew more than my father knew. Of course, 3.5 years later, I realized what a brilliant man my father was. I had never fired a weapon prior to joining the military. My father was older, didn't play sports like other people, but he also never hit me. I also asked him one time, "How come?" It's standard to hit kids. And my father said, "A real man doesn't hit a kid. An adult doesn't hit a kid. You don't know your own strength, and you don't want to hurt them." And I could see that was different from all my other friends at St. Thomas Aquinas High School and what was going on with them as well. And I was a varsity wrestler in high school, because I could weigh 98 pounds and be a varsity wrestler. And but I had never fired a weapon. I had never even been in a real fight. I'm Mexican with white skin. I grew up in a black neighborhood. So I knew all the African-American gangs, and I knew all the Mexican gangs, and I knew all the white gangs. And I joined the service, and now I'm supposed to kill people. How do you get people who've been taught and sometimes spanked for getting in fights, and now they want you to kill someone you don't even know? And not only do they want you to kill them, they'll give you medals if you kill lots of them for them. And during the Vietnam War, there was 2 things that defined you in order to kill other people. And The first thing was of course, racism and the dehumanization of the enemy. The Vietnamese weren't the North Vietnamese, or they weren't the National Liberation Front. They were gooks, and they were slopes, and they were slant eyes. And that kind of language was used to dehumanize the people that we're going to kill. And part two of that is, what does it take to be a man? What is the cultural aspect? And a man was a person who followed orders, who didn't run when there was a fight, and who was willing to kill for his country. And those two things defined it. Now, not so much, I don't think, in terms of women, but there was incredible male chauvinism and dehumanization of women as women. When we would march or run through hills during training, half the songs, the cadences, would be about the woman you left behind and who was having sex with everybody in the world, and you couldn't trust women. And they would even say things like, if the army wanted you to have a wife, they would have issued you one. We were at a rifle range, and there was an Asian American, and the rifle instructor pointed him out, and he said, you see that gook? That's the same thing you're going to be killing in Vietnam. Again, it didn't matter to him that that gook was an American citizen with a U.S. uniform on who might be dying in Vietnam. The only thing that mattered was the color of his skin and the shape of his eyes. And this continued throughout. This would continue throughout military service. And in Vietnam, it would get even worse, because there you would actually have to kill people. Now, you're out in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home. You're 5,000 miles away from home. If you run away, they're going to put you in jail. And so they reinforce that question of dehumanization. And in Vietnam, it was epitomized, I believe, by body count. For the first time in history, one country was saying that was winning a war not based upon whether they took the enemy captive or captured their capital, wasn't on how many battles you won or how many units you destroyed, but it was based upon purely how many people you killed. And Vietnam became a statistical analysis. In my unit, we were expected to kill 11 Vietnamese for every casualty that we took. And if they didn't have that numbers, captains wouldn't become majors. Now, personally, I didn't care because I wasn't going to stay in the service. By the way, I forgot to tell you, I enlisted at 18. I went to officers candidate school at 19. I became a commissioned infantry officer at the age of 19. I went to Vietnam, where I led 45 men in combat in 1967 and 68, which was the heaviest combat of the Vietnam War. And I was 19 years old and a second lieutenant. And so I had people underneath me that needed me to keep them alive. In Vietnam, when I first got there, they used words like search and destroy mission. And that was a big thing, search and destroy. That was standard practice. That was right up there with body count. But some military person thought search and destroy sounds too warlike. It doesn't look good in the newspaper, so they changed it to find and fix. Not search and destroy, find and fix. Isn't that so much better? There's no blood connected with it. And I think that continued to today as they keep trying to prettify stuff. I mean, Fallujah, when you were watching it on television, was a search and destroy mission, if ever there was one. And it doesn't matter what they say, but they try to change things by using that kind of language. My nephew was drafted, even though he flunked 2 grades. My nephew was only 1 month younger than me. brother's 25 years older, my father's old. And so my father felt he could have a family in his late 40s, and my brother thought he could in his middle 20s. And so my nephews and nieces were all 1 month to 9 years younger than me. And we were raised as brothers and sisters and not as uncle and nephews and nieces, although they all still call me uncle. But I think that's a drinking thing. And my nephew graduated 2 years after me, so I graduated in '65 and he graduated in '67. And within a couple of months, they drafted him. And he flunked the mental exam twice. And he shouldn't have been in the military. But in order for people like Rush Limbaugh or all the Daley brothers or all the Bush brothers not to have to go and serve, people like my nephew did have to go, even though he had nothing to gain out of the thing. And the person who wrote the position paper on Project 100,000 was a guy named Monahan. And he said by drafting people, he would be making people who were poorer and less educated have a chance to be able to get the GI Bill, to be able to learn a trade, and be able to better themselves, like happened in the, quote, Second World War. Of course, he arranged his statistics very weirdly. And so that's why my nephew was getting drafted, so that he could get job training. Well, the people drafted under Project 100,000 were almost universally one of two things: an infantryman, like my nephew became, or a combat engineer, someone out with a mine detector trying to figure out whether there were mines in the roads or not. Half of everybody was sent, half of all Project 100,000 people were sent to Vietnam that were drafted, and as a consequence of my platoon in Vietnam, or my platoons, I had people who couldn't read and write, and we would have from African Americans from Mississippi and white coal miners' kids from West Virginia. I had people from Cuba and Puerto Rico and Mexico who couldn't speak English, couldn't pass the mental exam, and were running around in the field. And again, all of that was to help them. They suffered disproportionately because they mentally were not up to what was being asked of them. My nephew was sent to Vietnam, to my unit, to my brigade. I mean, yeah, to my brigade, but not my battalion. And so a brigade's about 5,000 people, and a battalion's like, I don't know, 1,100 people. And I was in one, and he was in another, and we were still both Catholics. And we would send messages back and forth to each other through the chaplain, because we had the same lieutenant. And he never helped us once. And my sister-in-law had a mental breakdown, and that didn't help either. And by this time, I was a first lieutenant, but I was only 20 years old, with a high school graduate, and I had no authority whatsoever. Every other officer was a West Point graduate. And to make a long story short, during the post-Tet Offensive, my nephew was killed. He was shot in the throat at a place called Don Ha, and he drowned in his own blood. He didn't get an education. Died a virgin. Didn't get to vote for the people that sent him off to fight. Got absolutely nothing out of it. And my family was absolutely and completely destroyed with his death. I was the escort. I escorted his body home, and I brought it back to California. And they literally took me out of the field while we were on an ambush patrol, and flew me back to the United States. And I met his body both in Vietnam and in Oakland took a train from Oakland to Sacramento and Sacramento to Los Angeles, and with a sealed coffin because his body had been in the jungle and in the heat for over 2.5 days and then putrefied already. And I had to fight my relatives, my brother and my sister-in-law, who wanted desperately to see their son one last time. And I had to say, you got to remember Bobby, what he looked like when he graduated 8 months ago, not what he looks like today. War is not a pretty thing. No matter what kind of words you put to it. I'm not a pacifist. I believe there are necessary wars, but I don't believe that there are good wars. Wars of liberation, even in South Africa, the guerrilla fighters are going to suffer as time goes on. I worked with people in Nicaragua, in Organization of Revolutionary Disabled in the 80s, and worked with people who were fighting the Contras, and they told me, you know, we're not going to have PTSD problems, American vets, because we're fighting for a just cause. And that was true, and they had something much more to take home or go to bed with at night when they were thinking about what they were fighting for. But they still had to kill other human beings, and they still had to watch their friends die. And within 10 years of that, one of my good friends was a drunk, and the other one was divorced and was suffering just like American vets suffered. I think I'm going to stop there. And if you've got any questions, be happy to talk to you about them.
Mary, I'm going to, since we have you have about 2-3 more minutes,
Okay.
I want to intervene as a moderator. And you mentioned your nephew was, you know, not mentally fit, and you're a high school graduate, and you're mentally fit, and you went to Vietnam and you killed.
Right.
So, what goes on in terms of yourself, when you're facing someone and you're about to kill? I mean, what's the language you're speaking to yourself? What's going on in your head?
It depended on which person I killed. I killed 6 people that I looked at. And the first one was a North Vietnamese lieutenant, and just down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He had brand new, beautiful fatigues. That's how I know he was fresh from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because that's how other people were. And he had a really nice pith helmet. And he was shot, and he was had his arms underneath him, and he was on his stomach, on his chest. And we were trying to get him to put his arms out so we could see whether he had a weapon or a hand grenade or some explosive. None of us could speak Vietnamese. He couldn't speak English, of course. And so we did it by gesturing. We could see, you know, his arms were there. And after a period of time, we had to move on because it was a running battle, and we couldn't lose contact. And he wouldn't show his hands, and so I shot him. And we pulled him over with a hook and a rope, and he didn't have any explosives. His intestines and stomach had been blown out, and he was just holding them in. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. I'd seen bodies blown apart and stuff. And that night, we had to be on ambush patrols. And when you're on an ambush, that's where you break down. So I had, I don't know, let's say 35 men at the time. This was the beginning of an operation. And we had to break down into 3 squads, each one going to a different area. Hopefully the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong would go through our kill zone. And half the people would be awake at all times. And so people would have 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, never get a full night's sleep, never get, at the most, get 8 hours, most likely only get 6 hours. And And so that's how we would live. And contrary to movies, you know, you didn't even smoke cigarettes on ambush. The most you could do would be if someone would dig a hole and you would throw ponchos over it, someone would have to smoke down on the bottom. But you couldn't talk. You have to be ready to get shot. And that meant for 2 hours while you were awake, you only thought about home or your friends or the person you killed that day. And I didn't feel good when I was awake and thinking about what I had done. And when I woke up the last time, I took that and I shoved it as far back in my head as I could. And I didn't think about that again for a year. And that's what I did every time I heard someone or some of my men got injured. And that was take those incidents and put them someplace where they wouldn't get me or them killed.
Okay, thank you, Barry.